When it comes to getting the very best gaming performance from your system, you have a very clear choice between a high-end Intel CPU like the i7 14700K or i9 14900K, or going with one of AMD's 3D V-Cache based CPUs. And while we've tested the 5800X3D, 7800X3D and 7950X3D, it's pretty evident that the 7800X3D is the one to go for, unless you need the extra performance for more work-related based tasks. But how does the 7800X3D compare against its older brother, the 5800X3D? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Great, I've finished my filming. Now I just need to get this on here and I can start my edit. No, I'm out of space to store this footage. How am I going to edit this video if I can't get the footage on the PC? I can't delete anything. I need all of this for other projects. I'm doomed!
Conveniently timed delivery.
Ooh, my new NAS. Wait, how did you get in here? With the TBS H574TX NAS book from QNAP, my storage woes are finally over. Featuring the ability to add up to 5 M.2 NVMe drives, storage and speed is no longer a worry. With its slim and stylish design, it looks great anywhere, and you can take advantage of the lightning fast 10GBE capabilities or use Thunderbolt 4 to connect it directly to your system for an easy and convenient storage solution for all your files with no limitations. Click the link in the description to find out more. Now, for those of you eagle-eyed fans of ours, you'll know that we looked at the 5800X3D and 7800X3D around 9 months ago, and it was pretty obvious to us that you loved the comparison, and I'd like to think that we've stepped up our game a little as of late. So while we tested in a small smattering of games at 3 different resolutions, we've now taken it a little bit further, with the same 3 resolutions, but this time we're looking at 42 games in total. So why bother retesting, I hear you say? Well, a couple of reasons. It's a new year for one, so that's more of an excuse than anything, but also it's a pretty boring time for tech right now, and we seem to be getting a lot of comments about the X3D parts, so we wanted to give it some more screen time. Also, factoring in that our original head-to-head was 9 months ago, quite a lot has changed. New games have hit the market, including some that are more CPU intensive, and through driver updates, GPUs have found some extra performance that was laying in wait. So I wanted to do a more representative display of what you're likely to get on these CPUs, especially considering the 7800X3D has seen some considerable price cuts from its original $449 price tag to now just under $400. But we have actually seen it as low as $365 just a month ago, which is nothing to snob at as it presents a 19% drop in price overall. This also means with the 5800X3D now available for as low as about $314 that the price disparity isn't as large. And that gives us something else to talk about, because paying more for a product is fine, but if it doesn't line up with the kind of amount of extra performance, then the value for money aspect gets thrown out the window. Now, to test, for the 7800X3D, we used the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000MHz CL30 memory. And for the 5800X3D, we used the Gigabyte X570S Aorus Master with 32GB of Kingston Fury 3600MHz CL16 memory. So both memory kits are essentially the go-to recommended configurations for each CPU. For all of our testing, we used an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to alleviate any bottlenecks, and the latest version of Windows 11 was used. Though we are showing all 3 resolutions in this head-to-head, our main focus really is, as always, going to be on 1080p, because this is where the CPU is at its highest level of utilization, and higher resolutions will see the CPU usage drop as the GPU takes over the workload. Now, we've tested both processors in a total of 42 games, and we'll be showing about 15 here today, while also looking at the percentage differences between the two in all 42 titles. Though if you do want to see the individual data for all 42 games, then we will be putting them up over on our Patreon, where you'll also get a ton of other cool and exclusive benefits, as well as helping to support everything we do on the channel. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with A Plague Tale Requiem, where at 1080p we see pretty much what we'd expect, with the 7800X3D coming in with a 7% higher FPS on average. This result flips when we get to 1440p, where we now see the 5800X3D sitting 2% ahead of the 7800X3D. But this is a margin of error increase, and as the GPU starts to take over, we should expect to see the performance become closer. And this is perfectly demonstrated at 4K, where the CPUs are doing the least work. Here, the average FPS is identical, but the 5800X3D is a little bit better in the 1% lows by a margin of error of 3%. So really here, you could say that the results are inconclusive at the higher resolution. Assassin's Creed Valhalla sees some pretty high frame rates, and as a result, the difference isn't too big, with just a 5% gap between the processors at 1080p in favour of the 7800X3D. This gets even smaller at 1440p to just 3%, and then stays at 3% at 4K, where the frame rates are lower, and the FPS gap is actually smaller. So much like you'd expect to see, the higher resolutions drop performance and draw the frame rates that each CPU manages to achieve even closer together. So nothing out of the ordinary here. Next up is Baldur's Gate 3, and here we see the newer CPU really proving its worth, with 32% more performance on average, which works out to be a pretty impressive 62 frames per second. As we move up to 1440p, we see the gap narrowing as you'd expect from the more graphically intensive resolution, though the newer CPU still manages to push out 29% more performance. The more interesting thing to me though is that we can see the 5800X3D actually went up by 4 frames per second compared to its own 1080p result. This is likely due to a bottleneck with the CPU at 1080p, and letting the GPU take over some of the workload lets the processor stretch its legs a little and gain a few FPS, even if it is only 4 frames. 4K is exactly what you'd expect. The CPUs are doing the least work at this point and the GPU is doing more, so as a result the performance is borderline identical with just 2 frames separating the CPUs. Moving over to Call of Duty, where again 1080p is pretty much exactly what we expect. The 7800X3D sits with a healthy 8% more performance than the 5800X3D, but with the numbers being so high, this actually seems a little smaller than it does when you think that it's a 21 FPS difference, which is still pretty impressive. When we look at both 1440 and 4K, we see them exhibiting the same behaviour. They both seem to have kind of hit a wall, and we see only a single FPS difference between the two in favour of the 7000 series at 1440p and in favour of the 5000 series at 4K, though we'd class this as identical. Changing over to Counter-Strike 2, here we see at 1440p and 4K, performance reaching higher frame rates than 1080p, though we're in the realms of margin of error, but also as we're using an RTX 4090, the core utilisation is much lower at lower resolutions compared to higher resolutions like 4K. So basically the 4090 can't manage to show its full potential because it's being held back by the resolution that we've actually set. So instead we'll look at each resolution as its own kind of isolated result for fairness. It's here that the 7800X3D at 1080p has pretty healthy boosts in performance over the 5800X3D, with 19% more frames per second on average. 1440p sits a bit further ahead as we already explained, and now we see the 7800X3D outperforming its older brother by 20%. Which is a big improvement, but not as impressive as the difference that we see at 4K, where the 7000 series CPU manages to sit 23% ahead on average. But in all honesty, these frame rates are pretty ridiculous, and you'll never actually notice a difference when gaming, so swings and roundabouts I guess. Cyberpunk 2077 is our next game, and here we are getting much of the same results, with the 7800X3D sitting 34% ahead of the 5800X3D at 1080p, and then 24% ahead at 1440. But again, 4K is a resolution that cripples the CPUs, with another 1 FPS difference between the chips, this time in favour of the 7800X3D. But the 1% lows are considerably better on the 7000 series chip, with 15% more performance. So even when limited by the GPU, the 7800X3D manages to provide a slightly better experience overall. Enabling ray tracing has us losing performance as expected, but it doesn't change the fact that the 7800X3D is significantly better performing at 1080p, with 22% faster performance on average. 1440p has performance drop quite a bit and now levels off the difference between them, with the 7800X3D now sitting just 4% ahead of the 5800X3D. We again see 4K bringing the two CPUs together, with the 7800X3D and the 5800X3D performing identically in the averages, with another small bump in the 1% lows in favour of the 7800X3D. As we move over to F123, we see our biggest difference so far, with 33% more performance from the 7800X3D at 1080p. And even though Cyberpunk saw a bigger 34% increase, that only accounted for 34 FPS. Whilst here we're seeing 120 frames per second more on average, which is, well, pretty ridiculous, though unlikely you'd ever actually notice the effects at such high levels of performance anyway. 1440p is pretty similar, with 95 frames per second more on average, which equates to 26% more performance, whilst 4K is once again letting the GPU take over, bringing the performance right down to a 2.5% difference in favour of the AM5 CPU. So by this point, it's pretty easy to say that if you plan on playing at 4K, then you can save a bit of money and put it towards a better GPU rather than a better CPU. Next is Far Cry 6, and here we're getting another big jump in performance going from one generation to the next, with a huge 38% faster performance at 1080p. And whilst this FPS here isn't as impressive as say F1, it's always worth remembering that F1 does provide stupidly high frame rates, so in a way is somewhat redundant. 1440p sees the 5800X3D gain 2 FPS over its 1080p result, but we've already gone over how this is possible, so it's nothing of concern. Meanwhile, the 7800X3D maintains a higher frame rate with a slightly lower but still impressive 25% more frames on average. And 4K has the 7800X3D performing better than the 5800X3D by a noticeable margin of 11%, meaning that this slightly older game still has some performance up for grabs if an even faster CPU comes along in the future. Moving over to Hogwarts Legacy, where we see a narrower gap of just 15% at 1080p when compared to the relatively large gains in performance we were seeing before. The gap at 1440p is actually much larger, double the size in fact, at 30% more FPS on average from the newer CPU, and this is most likely because the newer CPU is doing a better job at keeping a stable frame rate at this higher resolution, whilst the older 5800X3D is falling behind just a little bit more. Then 4K is no surprise, with a small gap of just 2 FPS in favour of the 7800X3D. But like we've seen before, the gap in the 1% lows is much wider and means that you should see a smoother gameplay experience overall with the 7800X3D. Spider-Man is next, and here we're seeing more impressive improvements, with the 7800X3D taking a lead of 18% over the 5800X3D at 1080p. And 1440p doesn't see much change, as each CPU only loses a few frames on average, meaning that the gap stays exactly how it was and the difference remains at 18%. 4K is again a different story, and now we see the chips separate by just a single frame per second. So once again, we're seeing that if you plan to play at 4K and are choosing between these two CPUs, you should probably go for whichever one you can find cheaper, unless you potentially want to maybe future-proof your system a bit more. Enabling ray tracing makes frame rates drop as is expected, and the lower numbers inflate the percentage just a little bit, because even though there is a smaller gap in frames per second, we see a larger difference, with a 23% performance increase from the 7800X3D at 1080p. At 1440p this pretty much stays the same, although it does increase by a single percentage up to 24% more performance, but a single percent is frankly chump change at frame rates over 100 FPS anyway. Interestingly though, 4K has a bigger performance difference than most of the other games we've looked at so far, with 11% more performance on average. This seems to be partially due to the 5800X3D having very little decrease in performance across the three resolutions. Moving on to Flight Sim, and this game is notorious for having pretty poor frame rates that can only really be fixed by frame generation and a 3D cache CPU, which means that it's perfect for our X3D showdown. Straight away, we're seeing a nice and hefty 28% more performance at 1080p from the 7800X3D, though something of note is that moving over to 1440p, both CPUs actually gained a little bit of performance, and now brings the CPUs even further apart, with the 7800X3D managing to see 33% more frames on average. This all changes quite dramatically at 4K, where the 5800X3D continued to gain some performance, where the 7800X3D actually lost some. Now the chips sit a much tighter 9% apart, so not within a margin of error range, but still a pretty stark difference from what we were seeing before. Remnant II is a pretty intensive game in many places, and in the area that we test we saw some pretty impressive numbers from the two CPUs, with the 7800X3D getting close to the 200 FPS mark and sitting with 33% more performance than the 5800X3D at 1080p. Then at 1440p we see this gap narrowing, as whilst this 7000 series CPU can't keep up with its own performance at 1080p, the 5800X3D does manage to stay pretty close to what it saw before, and as a result we see the performance gap change to 8%, which is still above margin of error. 4K does what we've come to expect, and both CPUs take a backseat to the GPU, which in both cases only manages to see an average frame rate in the low 80s. So once again we can see that both CPUs do a good job of keeping up with the GPU, as they aren't limiting the performance any more than other CPUs might. Our final game is Watch Dogs Legion, and to get straight into it, we see the 7800X3D outperforming its 5000 series counterpart with 24% more frames on average at 1080p, whilst 1440p falls not too far behind, with a difference of 17% between them. 4K is where it all flips on its head though, as we now see the 7800X3D actually falling behind as the GPU starts to take over, and now the 7000 series CPU actually sits a margin of error 3% behind the 5800X3D. Why this is exactly is hard to say, but if I had to guess, it could be luck of the draw. Maybe in terms of the Silicon Lottery, we have a really good 5800X3D and a not so good 7800X3D. And where most games see the two falling pretty much in line with each other at 4K, they fall apart a bit here. But regardless, the difference is only margin of error, so a few retests could see this difference changing, so we'd chalk it up really as identical performance. So overall, that seemed to be pretty good in terms of a showing for the 7800X3D. Even with a few odd spots, there was never really much that had the 5800X3D outperforming it, especially not at 1080p, which is more of our focus as higher resolutions take up more GPU resources, which would pretty much defeat the point of a CPU comparison. Also, I do want to note that when testing CPUs, you sometimes see anomalies, like we saw in CS2, which sometimes can be explained by way of core utilization, sometimes driver overhead that's very well talked about on NVIDIA GPUs, and sometimes it's just good old-fashioned level of CPU bottlenecking. But for those who may see some odd results in CPU testing, this pretty much covers, I think, all of the bases. Now, something we always like to do for head-to-head videos is to look at the percentage differences for all of the games to get a better idea of just how far apart the different games have the two products performing. And this is where the 42 titles I spoke about earlier come in. Of course, if you want to see the individual data for each game, as mentioned, this will be up on our Patreon. So when looking at percentage differences, it's here where we see the 7800X3D holds a pretty significant lead, with all but one game seeing better performance on the newer CPU, with the only game that doesn't see better performance being Control, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it actually has a frame rate cap of 240 FPS, and both CPUs managed to reach that cap, therefore both coming in with identical performance. So other than software limits kind of getting in the way, the 7000 series CPU seems to be a much better choice for gaming compared to its 5000 series older brother. Most of the games sit in with between 5 to 35% more performance, with more than half of the games seeing over 10% improvements in frame rates. This is honestly pretty impressive and results in 20% more performance overall, which is nothing to complain about, especially given how the cost of each CPU is much closer than just a few months ago. Things only get better when we look at the 1% low figures, where the 20% overall improvement in performance goes up even further to now 25%. Even with this overall, it's worth noting that we do actually see a game with a negative percentage difference with Red Dead Redemption 2, although admittedly this is only 1% worse and therefore sits within margin of error, so this wouldn't even make a dent in the performance overall. All in all, the chart speaks for itself. If you're choosing the 7800X3D over the 5800X3D, then you are going for a no compromises type of PC. But would the increased cost that comes with buying a newer DDR5 based system actually result in a worse value for money argument? Well, to find out, we have to look at cost per frame, and we're going to do that in two parts, so bear with me a little. Now, when we compare the 7800X3D to the 5800X3D based on the prices that they're going for online at the time of filming, we see the 7000 series CPU sitting a decent bit ahead of the 5000 series CPU in the averages. This greater performance is enough to make the more expensive CPU actually sit with a better cost per frame than the 5800X3D, albeit only by a few cents, which is what you want to be seeing with new products. Then comes 1440p to ruin the fun a little bit, because as the overall average FPS drops, the cost per frame rises, and now the 5800X3D is the better value of the two. But again, it's only by a small margin, this time by just 4 cents. And given how small of a difference this is, there really is no loser here. It just depends kind of what you're after. Lastly, at 4K, and this result actually sparked quite a long conversation in the office about what the conclusion should actually be, as there are a few ways to look at it. If we're talking surface level, then we see the CPUs falling within margin of error of each other in the FPS, but the 5800X3D comes out as the cheaper per frame. But then kind of course it did. With practically identical performance but at a lower cost, it's naturally going to look like a better deal. Which brings me on to another aspect of cost per frame that we need to look at. So, we've looked at how the two CPUs compare in value to each other, but we haven't considered the other components. Now, since the 5800X3D and 7800X3D are on different platforms, we need to use different motherboards, and only the 7000 series AMD CPU supports DDR5. So that means that we need to use different memory too. And with the additional cost of these newer components, we might see things changing a bit. So to figure out the value arguments for both systems, we tried to spec up what is essentially the same system, but we're only looking at the CPU, motherboard, and memory. So they're kind of the only parts that really have to change between the systems. The rest of the PC could be, I don't know, completely identical or completely different, and therefore is kind of pretty much redundant. Now, for the AM4 system, we managed to find 32GB of 3600MHz Kingston Renegade RGB DDR4 memory for $139, and paired it up with an Asus B550A gaming motherboard for $169. And with the cost of the CPU itself added on, this would all cost $648 and some change. Then for AM5, we used 32GB of 6000MHz G-Skill DDR5 Trident Z5 Neo for $156 and paired that with an Asus B650A motherboard, which is conveniently the exact same model as the AM4 systems board, for $230, bringing the total cost of these parts, including the CPU, to $770 and some change, which is actually 19% more expensive than the 5800X3D base platform. But if we look at the performance difference at 1080p, then we can remember that the overall performance on the 7800X3D was 20% higher than the 5800X3D. So in reality, it's the same value for money. So in all, I think it's safe to say there's an argument for both CPUs. The 5800X3D is still a very strong product, and if you're already on the AM4 platform, then you're going to get a strong uplift in performance. And as I always say to people looking to upgrade, it's not just about the cost of the CPU, but the more important factor is to look at the cost to change, especially if you're able to sell your older CPU and maybe make some money back on it, therefore making a lower cost to change. Now don't get me wrong, the 7800X3D is in a world of its own and is more expensive than the 5800X3D. And what we're showing today is that you are getting around the same levels of performance for the same cost. Most people would be happy with that, and depending on the games you play, that could actually go up or down in your favour. What's also clear to see is if you're not on AM4 and are looking to potentially move over to AMD, or if this is your first PC, then the cost between a complete system, when we talk about CPU, memory and motherboard, the 7800X3D is 19% more as a platform when compared to the 5800X3D base system. So if you look at it, you're spending 19% more and getting 20% more performance. And that is fine, though I personally would have liked to have had a bit more. Personally, I'd like to see the 5800X3D at sub $300, and on occasion we have seen this, like in August last year where it dropped to its lowest ever of $270. So what I'm trying to say is, deals can be had if the timing is right. The other interesting view is that even though we were using an RTX 4090 for our tests, it's quite unlikely that consumers will be going down that route en masse. And instead, if you were utilising, say, a 4070 Ti or similar, the saving by getting an AM4 5800X3D base system over the 7000 series could leave you with some spare cash that could go towards a better GPU to fill that deficit that is lost by getting the older CPU. Sure, we're only talking $122 or so, but it's a start. And especially as we saw, if you're gaming at a higher resolution where the CPU is less in the equation, the extra GPU horsepower would make a much bigger difference. Either way, no matter what you go with, you're going to be happy. They are both amazing CPUs that can really push the boundaries of performance. And really, it comes down to your budget and what you're willing to set aside. Because if you spend more, you will actually get more. And in the case of the 7800X3D, we're talking about quite a bit more. So yeah, that's going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and it's just given us more data to analyze compared to our existing head-to-head. And if you want to see more content like this, we are actually planning some more, including the 7700X versus 5800X3D and the 7700X versus the 7800X3D. So definitely make sure you stick around for that. For now, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of really cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, access to all of our charts, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.